Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. We would like to kick off. Okay, good morning, everyone. We would like to welcome you to the third plenary session of the IST conference. I hope you had a good time last night in this fabulous restaurant, and hopefully you also continued on to the party. If not, shame on you. You should come back next year, try harder. This is a very valued tradition and as part of this community. I know some academic communities are not that keen on that, but we are very keen and take our parties very, very seriously. So you missed out if you didn't come along. Okay, also I'd like to, well, it's not supposed to do that, but I'll start with an apology that we're starting a bit late because we had some technical difficulties, because the panel is a beautiful panel. We have wonderful people here, but one of the panelists couldn't make it because of a strike in Brussels. So we'll now have a hybrid panel, which is always a bit more tricky, but I think she's there now. Hopefully she can hear us, and we'll see and hear of her later on as well. Okay, so this is about policy and the use of transition ideas in policymaking. And obviously, people who have followed this community from the start will know that this has always been a very important ambition of scholars engaged in this community. Not just to study transitions, but to influence them by working with practitioners, with NGOs, with firms, but also, of course, with policymakers, and also developing policy-relevant approaches. If you think about the early days of strategic niche management being developed, transition management, other kinds of approaches. Now we're talking about mission-oriented innovation policies, and these are all ideas that people in this community and others have developed to influence policymaking and how policymakers go about governing transitions. And this is also for the STRN network. This is a very important ambition that is also enshrined in our vision and our mission of what we want to do, which is to promote transition perspectives in policy and practice. And today we have a panel here of people who are engaged in policy making, to have this exchange together with them, to take stock, to think about, which transition ideas have been picked up in policy making, what problems have they encountered using these ideas. So this is kind of a bit taking stock and reflecting on some of the experiences. And then the second question for the second part of the panel discussion is then really about knowledge needs. In their policy roles, what knowledge gaps do they see? What are the pressing issues that they want our community to contribute some ideas towards? You've seen me already yesterday on the dance floor. On the first panel. So my name is Warren. I'm at the Institute of Ecological Economy Research, and I'm also serving as the current STRN chair. And with us today, we have a wonderful panel of 4 panelists. 3 of them are here, 1 in Brussels. So on your very left is Jennifer Hiscock. She's the Director of Electricity, Transportation and Buildings Innovation for Natural Resources Canada's Office of Energy R&D. So a very warm welcome. You've had a very long way to come, so thank you very much for being here. On the very right-hand side, you see Hans Brunnings. He's the former executive director of the European Environment Agency. He's now a professor of environmental governance at the University of Antwerp, but we've invited him today to reflect on his experience with the EEA, because I've gotten quite involved with communicating transition ideas to policymakers and trying to shape policymaking in Brussels. So we're very grateful to have you here to share your experience and speak freely about them as an academic, as you are now. And then online, now you just have a picture, but hopefully you'll have a moving Miriam in a moment. Miriam Boveda, who's a team leader for sustainable growth at the European Commission's DG Regional and Urban Policy. So thank you very much, Miriam, for joining us. I hope you can hear me. If not, we'll sort this out in a minute. But she knows what I'm going to say in the introduction. So thank you very much also to Miriam for being with us remotely. And then in the middle of the panel, you have Mapula Tsangela. Many of you will know her as a valued colleague. She's been part of this community for a number of years because she's also a researcher. She considers herself an embedded researcher, but she also has a policy role, and it's really with that policy hat at the South African National Department for Environmental Affairs that we've invited her to reflect on her use of transition ideas in policy making, how this is going down. So we're very excited also, Mapula, to have you here and share your experiences. Thank you for coming. Okay, just very quickly how this panel will run. Basically, I already outlined, we have these 2 questions. So each of the panelists will answer this question, share some of their experiences, 5 minutes each. Then we immediately move on to open question and discussion. I know you want to engage. We're a very interesting community. Many people will want to speak, so we go immediately to, after we've done 1 round, we immediately go to the audience, have question and answer and discussion. And then at some point we move over to the second question about the knowledge needs, which is of course also fundamental to informing our own research agendas and our thinking. So we'll move on to the second question. Again, do 1 round of the panel, and then you immediately go into question and answer with you as the audience. We'll have these roving mics go around, and hopefully also Miriam will hear the questions. If not, I will be here and repeat them. And so without much further ado, we'll move over to the panel. I also go over there, but I need a mic. So. Now? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Jennifer, again, great to have you here. Explain maybe a little bit of the context and what the Office of Energy R&D and Natural Resources Canada actually does, because maybe not all colleagues here are familiar with that.
Yes, thank you. So I work for the federal government in Canada, and maybe one thing for you to appreciate if you're not so familiar with Canada is that we have provinces and territories who have jurisdiction over natural resources in the country, and therefore energy. And energy regulation all falls under provincial or territorial jurisdiction. And municipalities are creatures of the province, so there can be a lot of control from that provincial and territorial level. So just to kind of contextualize where I sit in the federal government, we have the Ministry of Natural Resources Canada, so all manner of resources, forestry, mines, and so on, but I'm on the energy side. And the Office of Energy Research and Development funds work by our national labs, research conducted by them, mainly on the natural sciences. And then we also fund innovation projects led by academia, private sector, utilities in Canada. And we have the scope of the entire energy sector. So we're supporting carbon management and clean fuels generation, gas networks, as well as in my division, we have electricity, transportation, buildings innovation. I also have a batteries research team. And actually inspired by this work, and I'll get into it in a little bit, the Innovation and Electricity Regulation Initiative. So I'm more on the end use of things, and then we have an entire division that focuses on that kind of work that we do, but with Northern and Indigenous communities, because as part of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation process and also complying with UNDRIP, we have recognized the importance of that sort of relation-based engagement in development with our First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And so where I'm sitting, I'm on the technical side of the shop. We have other parts of the organization that deal more with the program mechanics and the innovation policy as it kind of fits into the broader context of the government's agenda. But I've got mostly engineers and some policy folks in the team. And the Office of Energy R&D, if I say OERD, that's what I'm referring to, has been around for 50 years. We were born out of the oil crisis originally. So our comfort zone is really funding technology development, research and technology development. And so we'll speak in TRL. You'll see a lot of S-curves and that type of thing. But increasingly over time, the organization has started to appreciate that when you're looking at the change that you'd like to see, technology is unfortunately a smaller and smaller piece of the problem, which is too bad because it's the easier part typically to solve. And then instead, you've got the rest of the dynamics around the new markets that need to evolve, the business models that need to be employed to be able to scale solutions. And then you get into the policy barriers, regulatory barriers. We fit codes and standards in that kind of policy realm. So there's now an innovation systems analysis framework that we use to describe what we're doing, where you've got those three domains of tech innovation, business innovation, and policy innovation. And I think that's been really important. It's really only been introduced in the last 5 years or so as identifying, like, this is who we are, this is what we do, and that Innovation and Electricity Regulation Initiative represents a relatively newer space for us, where we're starting to work directly with the economic regulators of the provinces and territories who regulate the monopoly gas and electric utilities primarily, to start to work with them to understand how they're trying to modernize regulation in the context of the new technical capabilities of the systems that they're managing, and increasingly the need to integrate our planning and management across gas and electricity and thermal network domains. So I would say, like, how the Office of Energy R&D, was that going to be a second question, how we're using the frameworks? Okay, I'll wait for that. But this should give you, I guess, an appreciation of where we are.
Yeah, but you have 30 seconds to say a few words about that.
Okay. So one is, as I've described, just kind of our narrative, understanding who we are and what we do, is starting to use these sorts of transition frameworks. The second way that we're using the transition frameworks is in our results analysis. So we're starting to look through the life of projects, but also after the projects. How does the projects that we have supported fit within a continuum of events that can lead hopefully to the outcomes that we're trying to drive towards? So we're using the multi-level perspectives framework, in part because I stumbled across it in my master's at understanding transitions. And so we've brought it into the analysis to be able to try to increase the odds of us having our projects lead to those outcomes by connecting actors to the results or to the projects midway, so that we have the right type of organizations watching what we're doing, and we're trying to convert it into a language, for example, the technical results into a language that meets regulators where they're at, or provincial and territorial policymakers where they're at, so that they've got some skin in the game and they care about the outcomes, and hopefully they're able to do something with what they're learning. And then the last bit, past results analysis, gets into a new domain. We're now drafting strategic approaches for each of the energy policy areas that we work in, and year plans to help deliver them, which include a lot more activity beyond just funding, because we realize that the funding is a necessary part for the opportunity to experiment, but then it's really how are we doing all those connective measures afterwards to be able to help them scale.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating, and also thanks for reminding us that teaching is a really key way in which we influence the world. Do we have Miriam? Miriam, can you hear us?
Yes, now I can hear you better. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. We can hear you very well. So thank you very much for joining us from Brussels remotely. Thanks for giving up your time. Miriam works for DG Regio, and this is not a policy field I would think most, Regio yes, but the cohesion policy part of it is probably not a policy field many of the transition scholars have deeply engaged with, but we've invited Miriam because of a recent initiative that DG Regio has started, which is called Cohesion for Transition. So Miriam, the first question, maybe you can set it a little bit into context and say what generally cohesion policy is about, and then move on to the C4T community.
Thank you, Florian, and good morning, good afternoon now, everybody. So within cohesion policy, we have, so cohesion policy is 1/3 of EU budget. We are now having a programming period which covers 2021-2027, and we have co-financing from member states of cohesion policy programs. And there within cohesion policy programs, we are implementing priorities which are in the European Green Deal, and we are implementing funding related to sustainable energy, environment, water, circular economy, biodiversity, as well as climate change adaptation and mitigation. And also we have a Just Transition Fund, which has been put in place by the European Green Deal. In total, we have a budget for the 27 member states, which is amounting to 128 billion euros. And what we did within DG Regio is that we thought it's important that we are supporting the implementation and the fast implementation, both in terms of amounts, but in terms of quality of the projects that are contributing to the European Green Deal priorities. And in order to do that, and because we know that certain member states lack the capacity to have sufficient information on how to implement these strategic investments, and we wanted to foster this knowledge, we have put in place an initiative, which is an initiative for technical assistance and enhancing capacities, which is called Cohesion for Transitions. And there we have, so it's a community of practice. We have, within this community of practice, put in place a pool of academia. So it's an academic sounding board. It's a group of people specialized in different member states on sustainability transitions, plus a field, so energy, climate, environment, where we gather knowledge to support member states in implementing their programs. And there we gather practitioners which are dealing with support in member state, and they are gathered into working groups working on different areas: climate, energy, environment. And we have a group of the academic sounding board, and they meet regularly. So in the first phase of this project, we had both groups working in parallel and meeting at different stages, so that they could communicate their needs from the territories and their capacity to tackle these needs. Basically, they were discussing twice a year in different conferences we were organizing, plus the academic sounding board experts were producing knowledge pieces. And now we are thinking of having a more aggregated approach. It means that we have the academic sounding board members who are participating to the working group meetings and tackling common questions or common issues where they see a possibility to work together. So we are initiating now this new approach to have a closer relation between academic knowledge and practitioners' needs.
And so the cohesion policy, a very interesting and important field of policy making. We've just heard the kind of investments that are going into this field. But let me now turn to Mapula. I already mentioned your several hats. Can you tell us a little bit more about your policy hat in the South African National Department for Environmental Affairs, what it is that you do, and what type of transition ideas you've used in policy making?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think it's working.
Okay.
Just keep going.
Okay.
We'll figure out which mic it is. It's number 2. Number 2.
Okay. Thanks for having me and good afternoon. And as Florian is saying, I actually have a cheat sheet because I'm a PhD student with Stellenbosch University. I'm actually dealing with the examiner's feedback now, who wanted more on socio-political reflections. But yeah, as a government official, it was difficult for me to try to pin down one policy to talk about because the reality is these issues are interrelated and cross-sectoral. So my reflection is about the experience in the climate policy, the energy policy, which links with the justice aspect, and then the third one being on the innovation policies. But the issue that we're dealing with is regarding the alignment between innovation policy, socio-political issues, the issues of market and the rules of the game, and the expectation in terms of what needs to happen now, but the reality, for example, of policy change taking around 10 to 20 years. If you look at our climate policy, it took 20 years exactly from 2004 when we had the strategy up to having the act in 2024. The same with our innovation policy. We had the strategy in 2004. Only in 2023 we had the white paper. So our experience with the white paper, for example, through the Department of Science and Innovation, working with TIPSI, I'm sure Johan is here. So I've been participating in those programs, and some of you, I think, were in South Africa in 2017 when TIPSI was formed. So through engagement between policymakers and transition scholars, we have been able to engage with transitions, but the tensions come in when we have to then implement. If you look at the Climate Act, for example, the NDC, we are regulating ourselves to meet the NDC, the ambitious NDC target, and we also have a Carbon Tax Act, but when we have to implement the act, the industry is saying they cannot afford to pay the tax, they also cannot afford to retrofit, and some of the infrastructure and technology are too old to even do anything with those. So there are tensions in that area in terms of what do we do if we are trying to transition. In the second area, with regards to we've got the integrated resource plan, which is about the energy mix. What is the appropriate energy mix for South Africa, and when is it the right time to phase out, for example, the tensions around the coal power stations? The reality is that once you start talking about phase out, it triggers the just transition element. How are we going to make sure that those regions whose power stations are closing will still sustain themselves socio-economically? And that's why we also then have a just transition framework and a just energy investment plan to try to address that, because the reality is there are real people who's losing socio-economic impact. Municipalities are losing revenue in terms of the town is no longer active, and now you find that they are not generating a revenue, but even the society is not able to pay for the rates and taxes. So it's multiple implication, and we don't have the alternatives that are at a scale at which we are closing the power station. At the moment, Komati is one of the power stations that was closed in 2022, but the tensions are, people are saying it was too premature to close it. It could still run another 5 or 10 years. So there's also discussions around extending the lifespan of power stations by another 10 years. So for the power stations that were supposed to close from now between 2025 and 2030, but now the talks are around how can you technically revive those, but of course others are saying but they're already in ICU, to run them it's also expensive. So those are the tensions in that area. And then the last one, as I said, in terms of innovation, there is a bit of lag. Yes, the Department of Science and Innovation is doing a lot. So the white paper, at least, and the decadal plan, and Frank, if he's here, the decadal plan has adopted the MLP and the transition in it. So it will be a legal policy in terms of the transition, and we're hoping with that process, the thinking around co-evolutionary aspect would then be improved and work in that aspect. But yeah, in simple, I think, yeah, it's about the tensions around how to synchronize what needs to be done now versus the long-term planning. I mean, we've got a very limited security of supply. The blackouts are kind of regular, and there's still the belief that large power stations were able to provide cheaper electricity at the time, but of course they have their own maintenance issues. So there's a mixture of issues around transitions. We all acknowledge it needs to happen, but it's a bit messy and in terms of how it should happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mapula, for sharing your experiences. And last but definitely not least, we turn to Hans and his tenure at the EEA and the use of transition thinking in policymaking. Hans, do you want to quickly introduce what the EEA normally does and then how its role has evolved, and then especially, of course, in terms of impact on policymaking in Brussels?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. I think after 20 years, the European Environment Agency was mostly known as the agency that gathered all the data from the European directives and the monitoring and reporting obligations, and we were communicating that. But in 2014, we had to write a new multi-annual work program, and I became the director of the agency. And I said, we need to do something else, because people don't think in micrograms and ppms. People think in societal terms, and policymakers do as well. So we focused on socially embedding our knowledge, systems of production and consumption, distributional issues, the link with policies, stronger policy link, which was not evident because people in Brussels, some people wanted to keep us as a data agency, and we wanted to work more systemic. And so we ended up putting the transitions framework at the core of our multi-annual work program by putting it in a title. And this work program was agreed by the management board. And the management, this sounds technical, but it isn't. It's political, because you have the European Commission, you have all the member states, you have the European Parliament, and you have the scientific community. So we had a mandate to work on this framing. And why this framing? I don't need to convince you. What was attractive in the link with policymakers was that it is inherently optimistic about our capacity to shape the future. Scenarios and modeling talk about predicting the future. This was about shaping the future through policy bundles, as I tend to call it. There was an agency perspective, and this inherently optimistic upward arrow of the X-curve. Okay, so we were there. We also worked with the network of environmental protection agencies in Europe in the agency, and the Umweltbundesamt in Germany and Austria were very much in favor. PBL, where Martin Heyer was the head, he was very much in favor, and a couple of others like ISCTE. And so we had a strong community to support us. But then we needed to make the link with this community. Now, I was part of this community, but so we were innovating our scientific community. And Frank Hales became a member of our scientific community. Fred Stewart became a member of our scientific community. But also the chair, Per Mikwits from ISCTE, he was very much in favor of systemic thinking. We had Andrew Jordan, who is more of a political science analyst, but he was also very much in. So we had a number of people, and good fortune in our management board, Lena Nij, who is here, became a member of our management board. So, I mean, people were there, and we started to work intensely with this community, organizing seminars, training our staff. But also in 2019, we published, which I think was a critical report on translating the theory of systemic transitions explicitly in a European policy context. And the lead authors of that were Bruno, were Frank Hales, we had Nikki Franciskaki working with us, you, Florian, worked on that. We had other people in the room. I shouldn't forget people, which you do. Julia Wittmeier. I mean, we had Karen Rogge who commented. I mean, a lot of you were involved in that. And it was a critical moment because it was building knowledge in the direction from you to us, but also the other way around. Understanding how this can work in an explicit, ambitious, multi-country policy framing. Okay. Then briefly, we have a flagship report called State and Outlook of the Environment. In 2015, it was too early to make a transitions report, but we ended it by saying we need more systemic transitions. And we knew then that in 2020 we wanted to write a transitions report. And we did. It was the title of the report, Knowledge for Sustainability Transitions. And that was the hook, that whole process, to connect to the top of the European policy institutions. And that was the preparatory steps towards the European Green Deal. Yeah? So, in a nutshell, because I see Florian nodding to me like, come on, man. But that was...
No, I wanted you to come on to the Green Deal.
You're rightly so.
1 minute on the Green Deal.
That was what we did to make a strong integration between this policy framing and the framework that you're all working on and inspiring us with.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience. I think we now have a fascinating canvas of different policy areas, from cohesion policy, innovation policy, environment policy, climate policy. So I promise more debate. Please, questions, contributions, challenges. The mics are open. I don't know if we have people coming around with the mics, I hope. I can give this one up, but there's one here for sure. So Danny, why don't you start and grab the mic and then move it around? Oh yeah, we should have, yeah.
So thank you for the your interventions. Those are really helpful and interesting. And I have a question for Hans, but I would like to also hear reflections from others on this. A really important point that you raised about the kind of esoteric nature of many of the indicators in the kind of Earth system. When we think about CO2 emissions, we think about atmospheric concentrations. Of course, these are really important, but they mean very little to the average individual. And so I guess I'm, even in my own policy experience, working 2.5 years in the federal government, found that we were always looking for kind of the alternatives to these, and I was never satisfied with what we were able to come up with. So I would like to hear from you and maybe others as to what you think are kind of some of the indicators that are actionable from and useful from a decision-making perspective, but also those that have meaning for societal actors.
Okay, well, first of all, and I think it's essential that we start from empirical good knowledge about the systems that we talk about and why we want change. And that comes from Earth systems and all the monitoring and the data we did. We were strong in our messaging because we had that data and the trend lines and the analysis. And honestly, I would invite this community to reach out to this physical data and Earth data more when you do work. That's my personal opinion. So that was, and we framed them in a different way. We connected them to DPSIR logic, or to transitions systems logic, or to provisioning systems. I mean, we used all of these images to connect this basic data to societally important decisions. And because we had that strong foundation, we were able to make these statements at a more macro level and at a more convincing level. We could also illustrate that if we would just follow these trend lines, which were all based on the assumption that if we would make the current systems more efficient, we called it the efficiency paradigm. We need to move beyond the efficiency paradigm, and this is not an ideology. Here's why. The trend lines will never get you where you have to be. And so you need not to do things better, but to do things differently. And so by connecting all these dots, we were able to come up with a very different type of framing that seemingly was convincing to policy-making audiences at the time, and that allowed us to carve out a space to creatively think about a different way of approaching systemic challenges through policy making. Yeah.
I might just add that we're finding sometimes the KPIs around mitigation are a little indirect and hard to relate to, but the KPIs around adaptation seem to feel closer to home. So Canada's already experiencing what feels like it's just going to be wildfire season every May. And so resiliency and affordability seem to hit a little closer to home for folks.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Julius from NTNU, which is the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And it's beautiful to have Hans here and Jennifer and Miriam, and I feel it's great to have people from the European Commission or the EPA or maybe from national governments here. But every year I come to the IST, I see a lot of new faces, and transitions are multi-scalar, and they happen everywhere on national government's level, but also on regional and on local governmental level maybe. And I feel that many of us PhD students, I'm not a PhD student anymore, but when I was, I felt a bit unempowered to speak up and maybe share the knowledge. So I was wondering how, and maybe one of you could give us a plea of who the PhD students who are just learning about these things, but that they are also somehow experts already, and how do you see the role, maybe not just of the Frank Geels and the Caroline Rogges and the Florian Cairns, but how do you see the role of maybe the next generation of researchers here who are sitting here, who are actually already experts, but maybe don't feel comfortable yet in engaging with policymakers on different levels, and if it's just the municipal level? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, from South Africa, you know, we always come with a crew of researchers. So we do have people like Maren sitting at the back, and Garth is also here. So what we try to do is research that is embedded within institutions, which includes local government. So Garth's research actually focus on the city of Cape Town, where he's embedded in there for a period of 3 to 4 years, working specifically on the transition. So we try, at least from Stellenbosch side, policymakers, but also they also working with the national government as well. So it goes back again, I suppose, to the ways in which we do research in terms of how we structure our research project to already intentionally include government actors, but also then the researchers along the way. So, but at least from Stellenbosch side, we work collaboratively, but also with TIPSI. With TIPSI, there's always new initiatives that are run in terms of the university, the researchers and the policymakers, and so that's why I think for me there are opportunities where the seniors and the junior researchers are able to engage with the policymakers on real world policy making and implementation initiatives.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and it's daunting. You know, you have a systemic approach, and your PhD is about this much usually, and so how do you move on? And for me, it has to do with how we train young academics. Do we give them the broader framework and then ask them to finish a PhD on this, or do they immediately go to this and are a bit lost in so there is a training element to it, but it's also a personality and skills thing. When I was recruiting people at the agency, I was looking for specialists that were also connectors, yeah? Because we need specialists, but that are capable of looking at their own specialization in the broader context and have the personal skills to work as connectors. And that's something we can train people in. Do we do that as an academic community? I know Drift has a new master program that is focusing specifically on that. Yeah? So those are really important skills, because then when you enter whatever work space, you look at yourself as somebody who has the capacities and also the task and the vision to connect the dots. And at the end of the day, what we study is connecting the dots. And I make a strong distinction between some people say, oh, so you're a generalist. No, I'm not a generalist. I'm a specialist in systems thinking and how it is applied. It's a specialization in and of itself. And we need to train people in how we behave as knowledge actors in a context that desperately needs people who are able to connect the dots. So that's my plea to ourselves. Yeah.
I'd say like find somebody who's talking in systems language and reach out. So I'm excited anytime I have students reaching out or their professors saying, hey, we're doing projects in this space, would you be willing to meet with some of our students and they could study an aspect of what you're working on, it could be part of their major project, please do reach out. But one other thing I want to sort of distinguish, and maybe the Canadian government is a little bit different in this respect, but we have been told deliberately internally that as the bureaucracy, we are not policymakers. So you want to make policy, go run for government, run for office, get elected. You are policy advisors. So if you're going to come and work with us, it's to understand how the policies are getting implemented, trying to encourage the feedback loop from the realities of what we're seeing on the ground, from the projects that we're funding, kind of having that go back up into the policy thinking. But there's kind of like a two-pronged process you're going to want to do if you want to influence policy making. There's understanding folks like me who are going to make a career out of it, and we're going to be here for the long term and see how these things go. But then you're also going to have to start writing the minister and figure out who their staffers are, and you start feeding into their thinking and their policy making, because that's where the actual policy making goes. And sometimes when it comes to them from the outside instead of just from us, they'll actually believe it. But if it's just coming from us, they're always like, I have all these other people knocking on my door, and they're of equal or more important value because they, fund their party coffers.
Yeah, Caroline Rogge, University of Sussex, in front of ISI. Thanks for this panel. Thanks for the panel. As my question is for all of you. And I'm starting with Hans, your final remark. You worked towards, with transition thinking, the European Green Deal. But if you look at the times now, these kind of policies are under threat. They're being challenged. So I have three questions for you in this regard, but they also apply to all other country contexts, right? Because I think the assessment is probably global. But the first question would be, what is your assessment of this threat and of these kind of systemic transition policies being challenged? How big is the threat? The second is, what do you do about it? Like, how do you address it? What do you do perhaps differently? And the third question is, how can we help you? How can we do things differently?
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that simple question. I will, yes, okay, but here's where your framework how I try to think about this comes in, because you could say that the new system of policy making was developed in the European Green Deal. It had a lot of characteristics that were very close to what we are saying here. But there is the landscape. The landscape has changed. Yeah? So that is putting pressure on that system. It's the logic of your model. And so there's an enormous pressure on that system now. And so that pushes us to start innovating again in how we use the knowledge that we have to maintain parts of that system and to change maybe some other parts of our knowledge. And in a way, it means that if we want knowledge in transitions, we will need continuous transitions in knowledge. Yeah? And that's what I think we are challenged to do now. What I don't see as a solution is to lose our own authentic message. So we can connect to discussions on security and competitiveness and all of that, but do not reduce your own message to that, because then you have no authentic voice anymore. So connecting those dots, I think, is important. We see quite a lot of delay. If the Green Deal was a game of Jenga, some pieces are taken out of it, so you know that the tower can collapse. There were some pieces of the puzzle that still needed to happen. The chemicals legislation, other major parts, they are delayed or off the table. This is a difficult time. But we need to stay the course, because we are scientists. And Earth system science is not changing because somebody says the Earth is flat. Neither is the thinking about the need for systemic approaches, because some people think that there are really simple solutions to complex problems. So stay the course scientifically and try to find coalitions and places where you can land our type of knowledge. And that's challenging, and I don't really have the full answer, of course, to your question. That's obvious. It's a search, it's learning, and voilà. Yeah.
Yeah, we temporarily lost Miriam, not because of your question, but to answer for someone in the DG. But Mapula,
Yeah.
do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, for South Africa, the transition, of course, was triggered by multiple things. Of course, the crisis of 2008 being one of them, and our own regime problems with our electricity generating company. But then when the solutions are being explored, I think where we need help is how best to incorporate the just element into the transition, because when the reality is that yes, the electricity shortage is a problem, but when the solutions come about, but South Africa is still dealing with the apartheid and colonial transition, socio-economic transition. So if the sustainability transition is not addressing those other issues, it becomes a problem. So for researchers, it's about how best to bring the multiple systems together such that come 20, 30 years later of 2050, we are not a green country that has left everybody behind. So we need a kind of research that can be able to help us to connect those very critical aspects that needs to be addressed. Use this opportunity to address some of the issues that are still a backlog within our context. Thanks.
I think it's helpful to look at to offer to do research on the impact of parts of government. So this is something I'm trying to sort out with Danny and Krista, is being able to help the government understand what it's doing already and how it could be improved. That kind of continuous improvement process is not something that we get a lot of resources internally to do. There's an awful lot of focus on just kind of implementing the next program and implementing the next policy, and this sort of longitudinal analysis of impact is something that I think can actually have a fair amount of influence, and is within the more of the locus of control within the bureaucracy itself, so we could act on it regardless of the government in power. And so that kind of gives you a bit of longevity that I think is beneficial. But otherwise, I think we're starting to feel like hopefully the governments are starting to get tired of trying to chase quick wins. It seems like a carbon tax isn't just easy to impose and then have that stimulate all the action you wanted. Coming down with hard regs is something, there's an aversion that everybody has to doing, but that would also be the easy way. And especially in our context where the subnational governments have a lot of power, we're finding not everybody can move at the same pace. So you really do have to have this kind of staggered, phased transitions approach. That's the only thing that's going to work.
Thank you. Next, sorry. You are in line.
Okay, I'll be quick. Am I audible here with the mic? But I can shout, it's fine. My name is Biposhi. I'm part of also Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium. So my question is actually, I'm intrigued by the policy making process, right? So I'm always kind of thinking around this, we always talk about experimentation. We always talk about learning, in this community especially. So my question is, while you are working in the government department, what is the kind of appetite for learning among mid-level and high-level bureaucrats when we talk about kind of engaged learning processes, co-learning, knowledge co-production? We are often kind of academics trying to kind of work with policymakers, and it's a co-learning process. But then I'm also always thinking that what is that space? What is that culture? Is there a culture that needs to be developed within government departments for policy learning? And that can then help in that long-term process of system change. And then a second part of that question is really what happens when those people move on? Because you were talking earlier about people move and their portfolios change. So often in transformative innovation policy, we are working with individuals who are high-level people, but then their portfolios, their roles change. So then what in your experience is needed in terms of institutional memory, in terms of infrastructure that is required, like people like you, for example, working across like an intermediary between academia and practice. So how do you maybe see your role, Mapula, around kind of intermediating that process, creating that institutional memory, and helping that learning process?
Yeah, I think Paula Kivima from the Finnish Environment Institute. I think mine sort of nicely follows up Biboshi's comment, and I kind of wanted to ask this for the benefit also for the new or the more junior researchers, because when we prepare research project funding proposals, there's always this section on the impact plan, and policy briefs are very popular, so all the projects produce policy briefs. Or we can participate in official consultations. But I got a sense, more personally, but also from Jennifer's earlier comment, that more personal connections might be effective. But you now might get 100 more emails after this conference, so you might get inundated. And then we have seen the rise of science advisory panels. So in a lot of countries, we now have a climate change panel. So I wanted to hear from your perspective, what ways of science policy communications are most effective for researchers who really want to make an impact?
Thank you, Paula. Take one more question, then we move back to the panel.
Okay, thank you. Antonella Maiello, Leiden University, here.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all your input to the four panelists. I really like the point about authenticity, and it's really reassuring to hear that we don't need to engage with the competitiveness and the defense, and our job is something else. My question is a bit of follow-up on the 3 questions that we heard before, and is about how maybe we need also to reflect then on our engagement with the political sphere, because you mentioned that this is also a political work, and I wonder if we now we created this science policy interface, so we connect with the executive level of policy making, but maybe we need to recognize that we left a void at the political level, and I wonder how, if we can also engage, and how we can engage more with these political parties, and also with the society, actually, because at the end of the day, the problem is that there are voters, there are constituents, and we are completely leaving this part of the world outside of our conversations. And how do you see this?
Sure. I've become obsessed with learning. Like I went into all of my team's performance agreements, and I told them, you have to use the innovation systems analysis framework to analyze the results from our projects, and you have to integrate it into the program scoping and planning. Like and I talk about learning for the broader sector. If the government's paying for somebody to do a project, it shouldn't just be the partners and the proponents of those projects who learn from it. The broader sector should be able to learn from it. So I agree with you, and it's a real challenge. At the end of the day, the executives within our government have on their performance agreements, did you avoid lapses in spending? So they don't have a performance agreement thing on broader sectoral learning or cross-government learning. That's not so. Everybody, my ADMs, the DMs, they're all excited to learn about these types of things. But at the end of the day, if they've only got so much time and so much resources, they're going to be trying to pump the next program out the door, and they're going to stop learning about the last one. So one of the things they talk about, the power that government has, is the power to convene. I would say we don't often get to convene as much as we'd like, and when we do, it's often at a point in the process where it's not as participatory anymore. So I would say that your academic community has the power to convene. Please invite us to go to things at our level as well. If it's my ADM, I'll give them some speaking points, but you're only going to get so much level engagement. It's important to have kind of a follow-up there, but I think your power to convene events like this, but even smaller ones locally, are really important. On the types of policy communications, I'd say these policy briefs and consultations, they're just kind of like a necessary baseline. We do need them. We need it written down somewhere. But in terms of the effectiveness of kind of permeating into the thinking of the institution, I think you're absolutely right, Paula, that these personal connections make a big difference. All of a sudden, somebody realizes you're not just coming for a funding ask, but you're actually coming to have a real dialogue about something. That makes a difference. But do you have a ISTRN podcast? Do you have podcasts?
Not yet.
Okay. I wish I had more time to read. You're all speed readers. I listen to podcasts while I'm doing the dishes, and that's where I get a lot of my kind of, oh, wow, that's a cool way that they're thinking about it. If you could do like these 30-minute spots, just kind of diving deep and why I think you should care about this, I would shoot it around to everybody and make it mandatory learning.
Excellent. Excellent. We're sort of slowly moving towards the second part, but we have, if you want to come in on this, this is great. And we'll have one last question, and then move on to the knowledge needs. Mapula, Hans.
Yeah, thanks. Short, quick ones from my side. I think as researchers, you need to be flexible, but also you need to have relevance. I'll share quickly 2 examples of my experiences. When I attended the Africa Wave with the minister, initially I had planned to introduce sustainability transitions, but then the theme was circular economy. So I had to suspend sustainability transitions thinking to allow circular economy discussion. But what later happened was, after the WEF Africa, then the minister went and established the Africa Circular Economy. But what was also interesting is that sustaining, being present, helped then to follow those ideas through, and by the time, by 2023, the circular economy that is inside the white paper is now saying circular economy in the context of sustainability transition. So unfortunately, change takes time and effort. So what you need to do is to build institutional relations with departments, but you also need to find policy entrepreneurs that you work with and maintain the relations with them. Another quick one example, some of you might be attending Transformative conference that's coming in South Africa later in August, and I was talking to my DDG about it, and then he's like, okay, start preparing the opening address, and I'm like, okay, but DDG, I'm afraid I'm going to be too academic, and then he said, no, it's fine, we will refine it. So those kind of conversation wherein you try and we work with them, and where we're saying, this is something I'm thinking, but if they're not ready to take it, you give them an alternative, but over time then such ideas get to become embedded. But it's about being relevant, but also being flexible in that, and then also being a policy entrepreneur in the process.
Yeah, my experience is that a lot of people who are in the policy making side, the mid-level, the technical people, that they love to learn, yeah? I mean, and they all have days that they have to learn, by the way. It's usually in their... So if you can come with something that is really relevant to them and that engages them in a debate rather than telling them what they should know better because then they can make better policies, something that stimulates their thinking and self-reflection, I think that's the basis. So the key question there is, at whatever level, you need to know the other side. And very few scientists really know the other side, just like very few policymakers know our side. And I've been sitting in the middle, yeah? And this is an important message, because very few people do direct science policy interface. There are organizations specialized in this who have one foot in science. They have a knowledge base that is set up, stable, longitudinal, and specialized in talking to the policy-making side. And in my own personal experience, not only in Europe, but also in Belgium and at the UN level, if you can connect as a scientist to these types of processes, your new knowledge is embedded in a system that speaks to policymakers. And you have a better chance of having a conversation and an impact. And then there are simple things as well. I believe in form follows function. You don't give the same presentation to a policymaker that you give to us, yeah? The number of times that I've seen scientists present to policymakers with slides that I thought, do you really believe that these people, A, understand it, or have a... And you all know this. Oh no, you can't read the following slide. Well then, bloody hell, don't show it to anybody, okay? Not to me, but also not to policymakers. We invested in the agency in a data visualization specialist and a knowledge visualization specialist. At the time when we had to cut staff, big internal discussion, our director is mad, we need to let people go, and he recruits somebody like that. Yes, we did. Yes, we did, because it matters how you show things, how you frame things, all of these things matter. So it's a specialization in and of itself. And we complain about it, but maybe we're not specialists in it. So go to specialized places and then bring your knowledge into that. That would be my more practical way of doing. By the way, Paula, thanks for the question. And I said that I would forget people who worked on this seminal report. Paula also contributed to that report.
Thank you. Last question on this question, then we move on.
Hey, Lukas Torsch, Roskilde University. I mean, we have seen this, right? Sustainability policies are globally under threat. And I've also talked with a lot of people over the last days. Many people also here have no idea what's happening right now in Europe in the omnibus. Which is shocking to me, right? You create this amazing knowledge of sustainability transition, but then when it's under threat, no one notices it because other things are right now in the media. And I try to push back on this, right, with my knowledge in network in the business side that I have from McKinsey. But I want to know from you one concrete thing that we as scientists can do right now to bring it back to the agenda, to the attention, and push back to all these attacks on sustainability regulation. And I also have one recommendation or suggestion, Florian, to you and the community. I think we should also maybe like write an open letter or something that we all sign and actually submit or call our MEPs, whatever. But because right now it's really dangerous.
Thank you. Mapula wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one thing, on day one, I attended the Global South session, so for me, the issue is addressing the just transition. But what was interesting for me during that session was how there's common patterns in terms of how the colonial aspect are still embedded within. But I could see the similarities between Canada. That presentation was about Canada and South Africa. Of course, the extremeness and intensity of the issues differ, but I could see the patterns that are similar in terms of how to bring in the local people in the transition that is happening. So for me, it's about the just transition element in it and recognizing the common patterns, whether you are in the north or in the south. There are some subtle things that are similar, but let's try to be cognizant of that and address those.
Sure. A concrete thing. We're really good at coming up with concrete things in government. So I think probably so sustainability is not dead. Like it's still there. It's just got a lowercase s and it's kind of at the end of the paragraph maybe. But like right now there seems to be a lot of focus on productivity. And I think productivity doesn't necessarily have to mean like vapid exploitation of resources and growth. But productivity can be an interesting conversation around bringing in these principles of efficiency and gains. And so I think at least the thread that we're exploring right now is sure, your classic components of productivity are labor, capital, and multi-factor productivity. And so I've kind of been leaning into, guess what multi-factor productivity is? So it's things like IP and AI and some of these technologies, but it's also organizational change. It's also having customer models change, business models change, interrelations between parts of the sector that didn't work together before that suddenly make the thing as a whole far more efficient and far more productive. So anyway, that's been a framing that we're experimenting with more lately, is the relationship between sustainability and productivity, as in like a sustainable productivity angle.
As a European scientist, I'm now speaking as the most important message is speak up, you know, be a knowledge activist. Stick to the scientific method, but speak up. There are places where until recently you could speak up and where it's now dangerous to speak up. There are more places on this planet where people like us are not welcomed to speak in public. I mean, I value that tremendously, and the irresponsibility of a lot of people in our social and political system to squander that sort of open scientific, societal potential is flabbergasting. So this is the moment to speak up. Do it now, yeah?
Thank you very much, and it's also a nice lead over into the second question we wanted to discuss for the last 20 minutes of this panel, which is asking you about the kinds of knowledge needs that you have in your policy roles, which maybe this community can help address. Maybe if you just each throw in just one idea, that would be fabulous. We'll take it in the same order. Jen, do you want to make a start?
Sure. So I was super jazzed to learn about the University of Copenhagen's work on the large language model analysis. Sorry. The LLM analysis tool that they're building on Gemini to be able to analyze policies, that's fabulous. Immediately, I want it. Give me that tool, because my problem is we can't throw a lot of the results and the data that we have into the cloud. There's confidential information in there, classified information in there, but if you can create for me this closed system, safe, secure within government, to be able to do this sort of longitudinal analysis of reports we've had over the years, that's super useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to get Miriam back so far, so that's why she's not on the screen. This is very, very unfortunate. Mapula.
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, it's about the alignment between innovation, policy, socio-political dynamics, the market, and the rules of the game. Because that's the reality of us in government. We have to deal with all those issues at the same time. But for me, it's also about how then to do it. And I'm an advocate of action research. And I would then encourage people to use such approaches. I mean, two flagships that I can talk about is, of course, TIPSI, the way in which researchers and policymakers work together with practitioners and other members of society, but also the Stellenbosch approach, CST method, wherein you have researchers embedded over a period of time, which they're working with real-life policy issues. So these issues, if they are being addressed, whether it's within a national or sub-national or local government, or even with industry, but at least it's action research, wherein the solutions are co-designed in that aspect. So I think it's not just the what, but the how part of it that is also very valuable.
Thank you, Hans.
Okay, well, one, we are expecting radically different outcomes in a system that is called capitalism, yeah, or you can call it the market economy, or whatever you want to call it. It's the same difference, yeah. Take the role of capital really seriously. If we do not address the role of capital, we will not get there, yeah. We are living with public budgets that are under enormous pressure. They are a fraction of the private capital that is out there. So essential will be to understand how we can finally, 30-some years after Rio, put some responsibility on private capital and leverage it in the right direction. And the flip side of that is take the social dimension seriously. It's not enough to say just transition, leaving nobody behind, blah, 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 blah. Take it serious, really analyze it and look at it in depth. Voilà. I wove in a second one, I apologize.
You did so very quickly, so it's fine, absolutely fine. Okay, we go back to the audience now with comments on these ideas, challenges, more questions. First hand I've seen is Dirk Loorbach.
Thanks. Yes, Dirk Loorbach from Rotterdam. It's a great conversation so far. Thanks, Hans, for bringing in capitalism and the role of capital. I'll make it worse. The role of the nation state is inherently tied to capital. And I hear a lot of good things, but one thing I really miss is transformative social innovation. In the Canadian example, and I think you have a very good progressive understanding of what transitions are, but in the three types of innovation, social innovation was missing. And I think we're still hearing a conversation where academics develop knowledge and we, in all sorts of sophisticated ways, bring it into national government and policy processes, but transition hypothesis is that will never lead to transition. It's the illusion of managed transition, and the real emergence is a degrowth economy that starts in social communities, in collectives, in cooperatives. And how do you see the support role our types of interaction between scientists and policymakers can play to create space and support for transformative social innovation?
Yeah, so social innovation, I guess, kind of finds its way a little bit into the business innovation, although it's not framed that way. That puts the emphasis on what are we doing for business. But in there with like the customer models and the business models includes things like prosumers, customers being able to own and sell energy back to the grid. And there is, I guess, a little bit of it was because we always have to have a connection to technology development, being in the Office of Energy R&D. Otherwise, we're told we're outside of our swim lane. So if we looked more broadly at the system of actors that are supporting a transition, it includes other offices and departments within government who deal with more of the direct customer or citizen interface. You know, the rebate programs for air source heat pumps or home energy retrofits and that type of thing. That's all a totally different shop, and it's not related to innovation. That's just adoption of commercially available technologies. And so a lot of the social innovation, I guess, tends to find itself on that adoption side of things, and not embedded as much as it probably should be into technology innovation. I would say there was like a little bit of attention when folks started recognizing the design sprints and design thinking that was being used for software development and doing this rapid prototyping type exercises, which would allow for more participation in the early stages of innovation. And that was something a bit relatable, but then folks always kind of struggle to say, yeah, but that's software. Like, it's really easy to put a bit of a prototype in front of folks, but when it's involving these kind of hardware, software interfaces, I guess they're having it's still this fundamental breakdown with the engineers feeling like, I can invite all these people into the room, but they're not going to give me good advice anyway because they don't know what they're talking about, which is just a breakdown of like the engineering discipline. Thinking that the back-end engineering is far more important than the front end. So I'd say that whole approach, we're trying to integrate more into the lab research that we're funding, but this kind of like, spend more time on the planning and the design up front, and you'll go further faster than you will if you try to like be action-oriented and just kind of try to put all the emphasis on implementing and getting out there. I would say that's still like a really hard pill to swallow when we're typically on 4-year government mandates. They want to be seen to be doing something really fast. So it's just empathy I have for you.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I do, but the challenge is they say, well, that's not your role to bring this about. That's the role of the Department of Finance or Economic Development. And so we sit on the outside and we can write some issue papers about it, but yeah, it's this problem of like, where does the leadership come from on that? Anyway, that's...
I think for South Africa, the problem is still a challenge that is acknowledged even in the white paper on science, technology, and innovation, that innovation largely is lagging to start with, let alone whether it's technical or social. That is the first part. But then the second part is where we have a legacy of certain planning regime, wherein if you look at even transport on its own, where people are located versus where the economic activities are, that already limits what can you do if you're staying about 60 kilometers away from home, but modes of transport that are available are only X, Y, Z. That is the technological part. But on the softer part of things, there are local practices that are already being done, which in the strictest definition of innovation, they may not look like innovation, but they're already being done, but they're not being documented. But it's when you have to talk about basic services like electricity, transport, and water, where then it draws people towards technology-based. But in terms of the day-to-day practices, there are many other ways in which people are organized, but because of the legacy that we're dealing with in terms of planning that has happened, then it seemed as if there's limitation around focusing on socio-technical aspects. So the Department of Science and Technology is trying in terms of the social inclusive innovation, but the issue is still the scale, and it feels also unfair where people are forced then to adopt certain practices, whereas they are maybe not efficient as the large-scale support that is already out there. So it's a bit of redressing the previous planning, but there's also practices that are already there, but by nature of innovation, they're not seen as such. Thanks.
I wouldn't dismiss the role of the state. It's an institution that gathers between 40 and 55% of the GDP through taxes and other, and then reinvests it in society. We cannot dismiss that. Yeah. Maybe the real question is how come in the 1960s and 70s, when we were building the welfare state, that the connection with social dynamics and social movements and that state was stronger? Where did it go off the rails? So maybe a better understanding of that, because then my second point is, we talk about science policy interface, how about science social movements interface? Yeah. I mean, there are very few universities that invest in that. I, by coincidence, was leading a research institution in Belgium that in its board had 50% representation from social movements. Really interesting dynamic. So science, social movements interface. And the third point there is, if there is one word that is a conversation stopper with the political field, it's degrowth. Degrowth, they do like this. So I do not disagree with the fundamental questioning of our current system of production and consumption and the role of capital in that, but we need to find other ways to address that. Ways where they do listen when we talk. And I was the lead author of the Global Resource Outlook. We head-on addressed the fundamental unsustainability of the current systems of production and consumption. We addressed the things that I know you are head-on, but we didn't use the term degrowth, and it opened up conversations rather than this reaction.
Yeah, I would say that's the trick. Like, is there a way to engage with it where we don't just get the door shut on us as soon as... It's a trigger word, sadly, yeah. Even though I understand why it's useful.
Yeah.
We seem to have lost the mic, so if anyone has the second mic, I mean, Floor, I know you have the one, and you have the word, but the other one, please bring it back. Floor Avellino.
Okay. Thanks a lot for a very interesting panel. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the relation to the political contest and democracy. It has come up a few times that there is a pushback, right? Democratic pushback against certain transition policies. And one of the things that we have seen change in the past 10 years is that it used to be that the discourse on sustainability, climate change, transitions was also seen as a very leftist perspective, right? And we have come a long way in saying, you know, it's not left or right, it's a global societal challenge across the political spectrum. On the one hand, this is promising. At the same time, I also see a big challenge here because there is now also an increasing amount of scientists and policymakers that acknowledge that the question of equity, equality, justice is a necessary condition for transitions to happen. Not only because it's a moral imperative, but also strategically, because without it, the resistance against sustainability transitions will only grow. But I also see a certain awkwardness amongst policymakers, and also in my interactions with European policymakers, And there's a certain paradox, because even though everybody acknowledges the need for justice and equity, there is also a certain fear that if you focus too much on that, that then it's becoming too leftist, or that the doors get shut, as was also mentioned in the previous comments. But at the same time, if you don't address it, then actually the resistance against sustainability transitions will only grow. So my question is, how isn't it time to maybe surpass that fear of being political or leftist, and just kind of and just focus on only the dry data, but perhaps also demonstrate that increasing scientific evidence is showing that some of these leftist policies, or whatever you call them, focus on equity and justice, just make sense in many different ways. So how would you suggest that policymakers do this better, but also us as scientists? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flo. We take one last question from up there.
Yes,
and
I'm
then
sorry,
we go back
I was
to the panel.
hiding the mic, I believe. And my question is for Mapula and Jennifer, but obviously Hans and Miriam, if you're here, also welcome to answer. And it's on the same topic of justice here. I'm from Sweden. Sweden is a country that has a pretty deep colonial past, with especially energy infrastructure development on Sami land. And so I would like to hear from your perspective, working with and living in countries that have a similar background of colonization. So concretely, what we can do as researchers to help and make the issue of equal and fair representation actually relevant to policymakers.
Thank you very much for this question. Back to the panel with one last round of comments on these challenges, on these questions, please. Mapula, you want me to start? Great.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I can try to give a practical example here. So if you look at South Africa's coal mines, it is one of the transformed sectors in a sense of the equity and ownership, wherein the Africans are now owning the majority of the coal mines, for example. Now, if you come and then you come and say, okay, there's now green hydrogen or there's renewable, but you're not addressing the issues of equity, and that is why then the pushback would come in to say, okay, but why should we transition? Transition for who? Because now we've just transformed this sector. Now we are told to shut down the coal mine. So it's those kind of practicality of saying, if you put a blind spot on the solutions without addressing then the realities that are there, then that is why then the pushbacks would come in that context, and it's in that lens, I think. And so even if you look at the solar, for example, so you do have to talk about the issues of local manufacturing, because if you import all these and all you do is to assemble and there's no even local maintenance plans, that already is number of jobs that we're talking about. So it's a reality that cannot be ignored, unfortunately. So. But also the other interesting thing is then in terms of other sectors that South Africa is still yet to transform. I mean, the finance sector, who's funding the transition? Because as I said, South Africa can transition by 2050 and be the greenest country, but now you have another new colony, which might be the finance, the capital. Who's owning the capital that has got this nice and green label with it? So it's real, tangible issues that we really have to tackle. Thanks.
Thank you. Jen?
Sure. I'd say on the comment on leftist, rightist politics and transitions, what's the adage? Think global, act local. I think that's some of it. Like, think about the national level policy or European Union level policy, and try to find a way to bring it back to their voting base. And so it happens that we tend to have more conservative politics around fossil fuel resourced economies. And so being able to connect it, like the just transition, is very much at the heart of the issue that's creating a lot of the politics around resistance in those writings. And so finding a way to be able to reframe it into something locally that they're gaining. I think we've fallen down on a lot of the just transition thinking, where it's sort of been too simple, saying, oh yeah, you'll just move from oil into solar and move all around the country to deploy solar farms. Like, it just doesn't translate the same way that the homes and the communities were relating with it. So I think there's some real careful thought and an opportunity to make it more local and more embedded, and that sort of community engagement influences a lot. Like, we're getting communities that are protesting against battery installations to make the grid more flexible and efficient. And people would have thought, batteries, like but they're citing risk of fires and whatever kind of concerns they can find around it. And so I would say, just because you're green doesn't mean you get a free pass in the community. That's something like the oil and gas sector learned decades ago. You go in and you sit with the communities, you find out what they want to do, you fund some playgrounds, you work with their community associations, and they see something that they're growing with, and then you get a lot further. But the part on the Indigenous connection, I would say that has been they've amplifying the Indigenous voice in Canada, through their own efforts, not in a way that we gave them amplification, but like in the way that the Indigenous communities have been able to crystallize a lot of what they are pushing for, and the right to be able to determine their own energy futures has really proven powerful in the overall political discourse in a way that kind of the leftist side wouldn't have been able to do. So in Canada, we've had this big bill that just got passed in the last couple of weeks, where they want to be able to fund some major projects quite quickly and reduce the amount of 5-year regulatory reviews that were typical down to 2 years. And so there was a process for doing that, and one of them included moving through some of the Indigenous rights applications, but you can bet that community spoke up really quickly and concisely, and so that got put back in. And so there are ways that we're finding our Indigenous communities inherently understand transitions and sustainability, and it's something they're never going to let go and never going to back down, and they've achieved a lot more than our leftist movements have.
Thank you. Hans.
Yes, Floor. To be brief, I think you're calling also for innovation in democracy. Yeah? And there are people specialized in that. I mean, there are a couple of organizations that focus on democratic innovation, legitimacy of the processes, institutional functioning, power and interests, and how they are connected. That's one part of it. In the role that I had, I spoke to everybody on the political spectrum, because you're a political official, an official, so I didn't make choices in the European Parliament. By the way, one of the biggest supporters of the Green Deal was from the Renew group, Pascal Canfin, who was the head of the Envy committee. So I think if you speak about things that people care about, health, housing, social security issues, the quality of their work, the future of where their kids will end up. I mean, there are enough points where we can come with evidence-based scientific analysis that is above the sort of immediate political spectrum. And then I'll end up by saying, and again, I know this is Eurocentric maybe, but when people are very critical about the EU and about where we are with democracy and all of that, and I always ask the same question when I speak to broader audiences, and that is the following, and there is never an answer. Give me one other region on the planet where 10 democracies are each other's neighbor. No? There is no other region. And the foolishness of people in the current political system to start questioning that basis, to me, is unbelievable. It is irresponsible. And as a scientist, I think I need to stand up for that privileged place where we live and do our job, and I'm now speaking as a European. And so I will never accept that the solution of the sustainability question is some enlightened authoritarianism. That's not what I stand for. And I also don't believe that throwing out a number of rule of law, human rights as a moral compass or an ethical compass, that by giving, we will not get there. So innovation, yes, superseding the old school political divisions, which, by the way, were answers to questions of the 19th and 20th century. That's where our ideologies come from. Where are the new ideologies that capture the big challenges of the new era? They're still evolving. I don't really see them. But populism is not it. Questioning democracy is not it. I mean, those are all not it in my dictionary. So that's where I stand. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We started 5 minutes late and we finished 5 minutes late. I hope that is fine with you, eating a little bit into the lunch break. So I don't want to make a big closing statement. I just want to say that one very important issue that has come up during this discussion is what is the role of us as individuals, as academics at this science policy interface, but it's also a question, what do we do collectively? And things like the TIPSY initiative was mentioned, which involves many people here in this room, but it's also a question that we've been asking ourselves more recently is, what's the role of STRN as a network? Is there an added value at this science policy interface that we as a network can bring, in addition to all the great initiatives that people here already do, talking to local policymakers or at the national or the European level? So this is a live discussion we're having in the steering group. We've set up a new working group, and there is directly after the lunch break, there is a special session to discuss exactly this question. It's in room C205, and it is about what's your idea for the role of STRN in this space for the future. So come along, have your say, bring up your ideas, and enjoy lunch break now. And thank you so much to everyone on the panel. It was fascinating.